to Postpartum in the Raw. Today, we are going to be having a conversation with Prudence Todd, who is also a midwife. Welcome, Prudence. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's an honor to have you here and to hear about your perspective as a midwife, as well as a mother to four children. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
Yes. So, at the beginning of every show, I just like to ask folks what their expectation was before their very first postpartum experience, and how did those expectations hold up or compare to what your actual first experience was?
Wow, what a question. Um, I just always wanted to be a mum and just really thought that I didn't think it would be a romantic experience without challenge, but I never foresaw what I would experience either. Um, I just considered myself a mum at heart, and so I wasn't afraid of what was coming, but I also wasn't prepared for what was coming. Yeah.
Wow. So, with four births, um, what were each like? Did you have similar postpartum experiences throughout the entirety of each four, or how did each of your postpartum experiences differ?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, one thing I noticed is that I experienced quite horrendous postpartum depression after my 2nd and my 4th, and after my 2nd and my first 2 were 2 years apart, and then I chose consciously to have a 4-year break because my blood volume was down quite low, I had anemia, and I wanted to build my body back up before I had another one, and I had every intention of having at least 4 or 5 children. Um, my husband was still coming to terms with that, but that was my intention. Um, so yeah, much my health was much better after the 3rd, and interestingly, he slept better as a baby, and after my 4th, which was another 2 years apart, I had really bad postnatal depression as well.
Mm.
So, um, I don't I don't remember having, like, post-baby blues as such. Mine always started around the 8-month mark where that endurance really had to kick in. You were tired, you've been breastfeeding for quite some time, and, any support that may have been there in the early days kind of dribbles off, and, it's not even there in the early days for some. I understand that, and for me, sometimes I had support, sometimes I didn't. Um, but yeah, it's it was interesting that I always found that around that 8-month mark where the endurance really kicked in, my adrenals were exhausted, I was exhausted, and just an underlying anemia that went undetected for quite a number of years really added to my postnatal depression. Yeah.
Wow. And so, were you a midwife at that time, or did you become a midwife afterwards?
Yeah, so I was a midwife before I had children. Um, I did that in my first year of marriage, actually. I was already a registered nurse, and then I did my midwifery after that. And then we were in a southern part of Australia, and we came back to our home area. And I was working in a hospital here, and it was a total surprise. Found out that I was pregnant. I'd actually come off a night shift and ended up in hospital with appendicitis. And I said, being a midwife, maybe you just want to check that it's not an ectopic pregnancy. And so they assumed that I knew that I was pregnant, but I was just kind of covering all bases. So they didn't even come back and tell me that I was pregnant. So first baby, I find out that I'm pregnant first time by a doctor walking into like an emergency room curtained space with me like huffing and puffing like a horse because I was in so much pain, and him going, "Well, you're pregnant." And I was like, no, thought I had appendicitis." So that was my first very unromantic introduction to being pregnant the first time. Had an operation, and thought that that may end up in a miscarriage, and she was meant to be here. So all went along, and yeah, I worked till I was about 35 weeks pregnant with her.
So it really was appendicitis as well, and you wound up getting your appendix removed while you were pregnant. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it was really fortunate actually because she was only about 10 days as a little embryo floating along and had not embedded yet. So I had the surgery, and they were concerned that that the pregnancy would be impacted by the anesthetic. But she was not in the womb space yet or connected. So she was still floating around. And fortunately, it all went ahead. I had the surgery, and yeah, just kept
Wow,
a keen eye
that's
every time I went to the
amazing.
toilet for a fair while after that. But yeah, it was all good.
Wow. No, I love that. That's interesting. That's actually very interesting. So, from a nursing and a midwifery perspective, do you have any insight on what you could have possibly done differently ahead of your second and fourth pregnancy? Because it sounds like it may have been connected to mineral or nutritional deficiency. Is that the conclusion you've come to, or what do you think happened with those two pregnancies?
Yeah, so in my very long but did eventually heal journey of experiencing depression with little ones, I did find out that I have I think it's called the MTFHR gene. So I had a gene test that basically showed that I don't absorb iron very well. And this can be a genetic thing. So I would highly recommend my daughter. I have a daughter and three sons, but I would highly recommend that she have the genetic test done because it would have meant that I took iron in a different way. And also, within the medical system, they're pushing resources, they're stretching funds. And so when they look at a test and my iron levels are at the bottom, but in normal range, and that consistently happened for about 8 years, I finally went to a holistic doctor who was like, this range for 8 years, totally not okay. So I got onto like prescription vitamins and minerals and all that kind of stuff and built my body back up. I mean, it's been a long journey of a lot of different things and a lot of, that's the physical component of it. I learned also through having my babies, my limitations of, even though I wanted to be endlessly breastfeeding until my babe decided to drop off of their own accord, I learnt that I could only give until my body had enough reserve to keep because once your family starts growing, it's like, I'm not just here for one, I'm here for more, and I'm also here for my partner and myself, like, I need something left.
Yeah.
So that boundary became a little bit firmer for me the more children that I had, and I realized that if I were going to be there for all of them, that I needed to make some clear conscious decisions as opposed to just being the mama who just wanted to you know, let let nature run its course, so to speak, let breastfeeding go as long as it could. I became a bit stricter around that and sleep time. Yeah.
That is very refreshing to hear because so often folks become discouraged when they don't have the capacity. And we're not always encouraged to lean into healthy boundaries for ourselves and making sure that we have a part of ourselves left to live, in
Mhm.
these experiences. So I think that that's a really amazing point that you bring up. In your practice as a midwife, what are some of the common things that you see with some of the families that you're supporting that are struggling with their postpartum seasons?
Yeah, so I don't practice as a midwife anymore. I used to, but now I practice as a holistic pelvic care practitioner. So the things that I see postpartum are very specific to, the aspects of birth that leave us feeling um, the way women describe it, even though I don't see it this way, is feeling broken, feeling like we're heavy in our bodies, feeling like things just aren't right with our bodies anymore. I just don't feel the same as I used to. Um, some of the things that the key issues I see women struggle with is connection with themselves. as a woman, connection with their partners, connection with their babies. And that is often because there's been some emotional um, lingering from the birth experience. And sometimes it's actually from previous to the birth experience, but this is where it shows up, right? So I think it was Tammy Kent that said, you know, birth or illness will bring us home in our bodies. And so that's really what I see a lot in my practice is women just really grieving not being connected and that having a ripple effect in their relationships with those that they love around them, which is so significant in postpartum. I mean, we want this to be one of the most beautiful experiences of our lives. And even though I think there is definitely more awareness around the physical care of our bodies postpartum, that is building, which is really, really beautiful to see. And I see mums now making choices and partners staying home from work longer that I just think is just amazing.
Yeah,
Um, there is still an emotional and a spiritual aspect to the postpartum period that we're still learning about
absolutely.
in ourselves. Yeah.
No, I love that. In my personal practice, I focus on traditional postpartum.
Hmm.
And so it is very heavily emotional,
Yeah.
spiritual, um, honoring and restoring that respect for what just happened.
Hmm.
And it's just very rare in our Western culture overall to really keep those pieces, but it's what we need ultimately. Because when we don't have it, those are the pieces that are causing us to crash and burn in some really significant ways. So, are there any particular traditions or practices in your family, or maybe just that you looked into since you were already a midwife ahead of time, you were already a nurse? Is there anything that you intentionally made a part of your postpartum experience?
Yeah. I mean, something that very much guided the postpartum experience for me was that I chose to have my 4 babies at home. So that, you know, the whole entry into the postpartum period is very different to if you're not birthing babe at home. And I certainly don't have any judgment either way. Women choose exactly what works for them. Um, and I have the deepest respect for women who move their bodies in labor around to different places and then they birth and then they transition back home. I just think it's incredible. It's not something that it even occurred to me to do. But what I set up for myself in being at home was being able to not move very much. Um, and often when I'm seeing women, particularly women that have had challenging births, that postpartum period where they can be very mobile afterwards, perhaps shifting from ward to ward if bubbies ended up in special care or something like that, um, not being able to rest their bodies. Often we'll be dealing with the emotional impact of that birth, but then we'll also be dealing with the physical that just kind of got sat to the side. So I feel very privileged to have made the choices based on where my heart was at the time. And that as I went on with having my babes, I did choose longer periods of time. Like I remember my third baby, I didn't go anywhere for 2 weeks. And that was like, I didn't even get in the car, didn't go anywhere. Um, I think my hubby 2 weeks was max time that he ever had off. Sometimes he had 2 days, sometimes he was straight back into work.
Mm.
Um, so it was different every time, and I remember my daughter recently, I was chatting with her, she's 20, and she was just sharing she's very, very intrigued with birth and not ready to have a baby yet herself, but she just loves everything about it, and she was saying to me how she feels really strongly not to be a part of any trend with motherhood. She's like, there's lots of trends with motherhood now, but she said, I feel like when you mothered us, you did what intuitively was right with every single one, and with each one, it was different. So for some of them, I kept the placenta and I planted it because that felt special. That felt where I was at. For others, I ingested the placenta because I had been bleeding. And so I learnt from that experience, and I was like, I chatted to my dad. My mum and dad were always really supportive of my birth choices, and dad was like, "Oh, well, cows eat their placentas on the farm, so I guess that makes sense." That was his response. And so yeah, I just took a piece and sat it under my tongue, and it was like the body's acknowledgement of that being in my body knew that things were finished now. Um, I also encapsulated my placenta for another baby and used that. And I know there's no, to my knowledge, there's only anecdotal evidence about placenta encapsulation being helpful for women. But I definitely did notice that when I ingested the placenta, that I had a very quick recovery. My womb always went back very quickly. Um, so yeah, definitely home birth set me up for my postpartum period. I didn't really do any meal situations, and I look at women now and I just think, "Oh, that's just such a beautiful thing to do and to be prepared in that way." I did have people drop things around sporadically, which was really beautiful, but one thing I choose now, even as a mum, is recently I was like, "You know what? I'm always gonna be in the postpartum period, and there's no reason why I can't get broth made for me now." So
No,
I'm
that's
like,
right.
I'm 44, and I get people to make me food now, and I pay for it because that takes care of me. And I think whatever stage we're in, it's beautiful if you can start in the early postpartum because it sets up this beautiful nurturing habit to take care of ourselves.
It does, and I'm glad that you mentioned that because postpartum is definitely forever. You know, in the wider culture, it's typically the first 2 years, but I've read some research that talks about, like, on a cellular level, it could be up to 10 years
Hmm.
before our body actually goes back to its. It never really goes back to normal, but where we kind of reach this homeostasis if we've been eating optimally and exercising and all of that. And if we haven't, and God forbid our hormones are out of whack, it could take even longer for our
Yeah,
body to recover and to heal. But it's never too late to honor yourself and your body and your birth experiences. If
yeah, it's
you
really.
if
Sorry, you.
you had any advice
Hmm.
for um, a first time second trimester mom that is seeing all kinds of stuff on social media, you being a mom of four, midwife, nurse, what would you advise them as they prepare for their postpartum season?
Mm. I think of this often because, when I had my kids, there was the odd VHS video or DVD floating around, but we certainly didn't have access to all the support, and the support is incredible. But I think one of the things that I feel is really important is for women to take a break from all of it and to really sit with their own bodies and to sit with their own hearts and understand that they have been created with an internal wisdom and an internal intuition, a connection, and they have medicine there as well, ready, waiting for whatever might happen. And so, I think we have access to so much, so many resources, so much external support. One of my biggest encouragement for women now is it's not to completely block that out, but to take some time to reconnect or to be connected to yourself. And I think some of the biggest um, aha moments when women are with me postpartum is that they're like, I used to be so connected, and somewhere along the way, I'm not anymore. And I think the focus becomes so much about the baby and how do I take care of the baby and how am I going to birth this baby and where am I going to birth, and all the information starts pouring in, which is so freely accessible, that we forget that there's so much resting inside of ourselves. So yeah, just taking time each day just to connect in, letting yourself know I'm here and I care and how can I support you. What is it that you need right now? Is there a message that you have for me? Like all of those things that keep us connected within so that we actually trust ourselves, because I think we live in such a fear-based society, um, that our body our body absorbs that
Yeah.
no matter how hard we're trying not to. And our body needs reassurance that she can rest. And that
Mhm.
connection into self brings that reassurance, knowing ourselves, knowing that we've made choices that feel good to us. The person that I'm going to birth with feels good to me. If you're having a conversation with yourself and yourself's going, I'm not sure about this person, you can then
Mhm.
take time to really go, okay, what am I going to do with this? When we
Mhm.
pay attention to that, our body trusts us. It starts to be that softening. Yeah, yeah.
You're so right. And I think even when you're talking about like pelvic floor health, so many people have normalized accidents and feeling like their womb is going to drop out, and they just try to, you know, do these different things that are just quick fixes so that they can get through their day. But it's like, these are things that are going to impact us for the rest of our lives as women. And the importance of prioritizing and trusting, like, hey, it doesn't feel right. I
Mhm.
need to get this checked out, you
Yeah,
know? And
yeah.
so, in your current line of work, focusing on pelvic health, what are some, I don't know, maybe the top three things that you would share for postpartum moms to be on the lookout as an unhealthy indicator that they're going to need some additional support?
Yeah, so depending on the birth, but also irrespective of the birth, the first and foremost thing I would say is, if you are feeling heavy in the vulva or the vagina at any time, please listen to it and lay your body down, even if it's with your baby on top of you, beside you, even if it's for 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be for an hour, even 20 minutes, but it's your body calling to you that there is weight resting in that pelvic space that is heavy. And just like when we get a sore shoulder and our shoulder starts to ache and we like want to give it some love and attention, this is our body going, I'm aching and I need a rest. And this is a skill that if we get it right, will prevent prolapse, will prevent leaking. If we ignore it, it creates a heaviness in the pelvis that, with anything that we ignore in our body starts to become exacerbated. Um, and, I only learnt about this. I had this feeling. I remember it in my early postpartum days, this feeling of just being like, oh, I remember the feeling thinking, oh, I'd never really tore badly. I had a tiny little graze once, and I always just used to think, "It must just be that little graze." Um,
Mhm.
I still get that feeling, not very often. I'm on a cycle at the moment, and I'm getting it really intensely, and I personally believe that it's because I am carrying a lot of emotional I'm supporting a lot going on emotionally in my family right now, and everything we feel in our heart is resting in our pelvis, and my body is saying, "You need to rest." I'm getting a lot of aching. It's not normal for me. I remember it in the early days. So one thing, it's really important. If you feel that, lay down, pop your feet up on the couch, or just rest on your back for 5 minutes. And when women say to me, when I let them know about that piece of information, I've had women say to me, "You know that thing you told me to do where you just like it's just so menial, just lay down your back." It actually works. Like when I do it, it works. So don't underestimate the little things. Um, Another thing I would say to be really mindful of is taking care of your breaths, whether you are breastfeeding or you're not. Stay connected to your breaths. They have so much love to give and receive. And when we connect into that area, it connects us into our heart space, and that pours love down into the rest of our body. So just doing a simple, gentle connection, even doesn't have to be a massage or anything, but just being mindful and connecting into the breast area, I think can become such a source of outgiving. whether that's for a partner or a baby, it's like my breasts are there for others, but really being mindful that you sending your breasts love is really, really, really important. Um, and also just paying attention to pain. So many women normalize pain,
Mm.
whether that's, and you've just touched on it now, whether that's an emotional pain because my body's not functioning the way it used to be, um, or whether that's pain during sexual intimacy. Um, we are such nurturers and such givers at heart. That's how we function. That's how we keep life alive, is to give of ourselves. Um, but there actually is a way to enjoy sexual intimacy, to be able to be in your body without it being that you continue on broken or that you just kind of persevere in pain. Yeah. It doesn't have to be that way. Yeah.
It's so important. It's so important to value ourselves and to honor ourselves, and all that we give
Yeah.
the people that we care about. So, before we go, I would love for you to share some of the work that you're doing, a bit about your organization and how people can find you.
Oh, thank you so much. So yeah, I have a business. I'm the founder of Your Womanhood, and I people can find me on Instagram under Your Womanhood, or on Facebook as Prudence Todd, the name that's here today. Um, and I see women online for support in preparation for birth and also in healing from birth, whether that's just a birth that they need debriefing from, whether that's a birth that's been traumatic for them. I also see women that have experienced stillbirth and miscarriage. It's I see women also in their later years, even women in their 70s and 80s. And one of the things that really um, I notice is the shame and guilt that they carry for the period of time that they knew that something wasn't right. But they either, one, didn't know what wasn't right, or two, they did and they didn't do anything about it. And there is an awareness now that women have in a lot of the world. It's not everywhere, but for a lot of women these days, we do have the awareness, but we still have to make the choice to do something with that. Um, so I see women online. I also see women in person if they're local. But if women need support online, I help women with the emotional and the physical impacts of birth trauma. So that's something I really specialize in, and set them up with exercises both to learn the compassionate dialogue with themselves, because I feel that if a woman has tools, she won't actually use them if there's not that beautiful relationship with herself.
Yeah,
So that's really important to me, that there's a whole picture here for a woman to take time to reconnect, learn how to take care of herself, and then those tools become tools that she'll use for the rest of her life. Yeah.
I love that because it all is so connected.
Mhm.
Awesome. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your story and giving us some really great advice and nuggets. And thank you to everyone that has tuned in for this particular episode of Postpartum in the Raw. I appreciate you guys, and we will talk soon.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline.
Cool.